Pennsylvania is going all in on Bitcoin. It's a huge GE gamble. We're talking about potentially investing almost $1 billion of state funds.
It's really remarkable. It's a level of commitment to cryptocurrency we haven't seen before from a state government.
Yeah. We're diving deep into two pieces of legislation that show just how serious Pennsylvania is about this.
These bills really signal a deep commitment to making Bitcoin part of their financial and technological infrastructure.
Absolutely. But before we get into the specifics, let's take a step back for a second.
Sure.
For those who might not be totally familiar, what exactly is Bitcoin?
Well, at its core, Bitcoin is a digital currency. It operates independently of any central bank or government.
So no Federal Reserve, no Treasury Department controlling it.
Exactly. It relies on something called a blockchain, which is essentially a decentralized public ledger. Every transaction is recorded on this blockchain.
Okay, so it's like a digital version of cash, but with some extra layers of security and transparency built in.
That's a good way to think about it.
But what makes it so different from other digital payment systems we use every day, like Apple Pay or Venmo?
A key difference is decentralization. Those other systems rely on intermediaries like banks to process transactions. Bitcoin cuts out the middleman entirely.
Interesting. So how does that work in practice?
Transactions are verified and recorded by a network of computers spread all over the world.
So it's like a peer-to-peer system for money.
Precisely. And this makes it much more resistant to censorship or control by any single entity.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
But I've also heard a lot about Bitcoin being a store of value, like digital gold. What's that all about?
That gets to the heart of why some people are so excited about Bitcoin. Its code limits the total number of Bitcoins that can ever exist.
There's a fixed supply.
Yes, 21 million to be exact. And this is designed to mimic the scarcity of precious metals like gold.
Which have historically been seen as a hedge against inflation.
Exactly. The idea is that as the value of the dollar decreases due to inflation, the value of Bitcoin with its limited supply will go up.
So they're betting that Bitcoin will hold its value better than the dollar over time. That's a pretty big bet, especially for a state government.
It is. And it's definitely generating a lot of debate. Some see it as a visionary move, while others think it's incredibly risky.
Well, let's dive into those risks a bit later. For now, let's take a closer look at that first piece of legislation we mentioned. House Bill 2481. I think it's also been called the Bitcoin Rights Bill, right?
That's right. And it had surprising support from both sides of the aisle, including the business community.
Yeah, it seems like it really struck a chord with a lot of people. So what exactly are these Bitcoin rights that it protects?
It focuses on three fundamental rights: self-custody of digital assets, the ability to operate blockchain nodes, and the freedom to conduct transactions without interference from local restrictions.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What does self-custody actually mean in practice?
Imagine you have a physical dollar bill. You can keep it in your wallet, spend it, or give it to someone else without needing permission from a bank.
Right. It's your money.
Exactly. Self-custody of Bitcoin is similar. It means you have complete control over your Bitcoin.
You hold your own private keys and manage your funds directly.
Exactly, without relying on a third party like an exchange.
So it's like holding your own money instead of keeping it in a bank. More control, but also more responsibility.
You got it.
What about those blockchain nodes you mentioned? What do they do?
Running a blockchain node means you're actively participating in the Bitcoin network. Your computer helps validate and relay transactions.
So you're basically part of the system that makes Bitcoin work.
Exactly. The more nodes there are, the more decentralized and resilient the network becomes.
And this bill protects people's right to do that.
Gotcha. What about that freedom to conduct transactions without interference? What does that look like?
This part of the bill is about preventing local governments from enacting ordinances that could stifle Bitcoin adoption.
So, like, a city couldn't ban businesses from accepting Bitcoin payments.
Precisely. It's about ensuring a consistent regulatory environment across the state. Makes it easier for people and businesses to use Bitcoin without worrying about running into different rules in different places.
That's the idea.
It really seems like they're going all in on this technology.
They are. And this Bitcoin rights bill is just the first step. The next piece of legislation we'll dive into takes this commitment to a whole new level.
Oh boy. I'm almost afraid to ask. What's next?
This is where it gets really interesting. House Bill 2664.
This is the one that would let Pennsylvania invest a ton of money into Bitcoin, right?
It's called the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Act. And yeah, it's pretty bold. It proposes allowing the state to invest up to 10% of three major state funds into Bitcoin.
Three. Which ones?
The general fund,
Okay,
the rainy day fund,
right.
and the state investment fund.
Now, 10% of those funds, we're talking potentially hundreds of millions, maybe even close to $1 billion. That's a lot of taxpayer money.
Yeah.
What's the logic behind such a move?
The main argument is that Bitcoin could act as a hedge against inflation, much like gold.
Because of that fixed supply we talked about earlier.
Right. Proponents of this bill believe that as the dollar loses value due to inflation, Bitcoin's value will go up, and that'll help preserve the state's purchasing power over time.
So it's a bet on Bitcoin outperforming the dollar in the long run, protecting those funds from losing value. But isn't gold already considered a safe haven against inflation? Why not just stick with that?
That's a good question, and it's one that a lot of people are asking. Some proponents argue that Bitcoin is actually superior to gold in today's world.
How so?
Well, for one thing, it's a lot easier to store and transfer. Imagine trying to move $1 billion worth of gold bars versus $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. It's just not practical.
That's true. Gold is heavy.
Yeah, and Bitcoin is also more divisible, allowing for smaller transactions. And then there's the argument that it's more resistant to government manipulation than gold is.
Interesting. But even if we forget about the gold comparison, I'm still nervous about those Bitcoin price swings.
Yeah.
It's so volatile. How can the state justify putting so much public money into something that could lose a huge chunk of its value overnight?
You're hitting on one of the biggest concerns about this bill, that volatility risk. Critics argue that Bitcoin's price fluctuations are just way too unpredictable for government to be gambling with taxpayer money.
Especially such a huge amount.
Exactly. They point to past instances where Bitcoin's value has plummeted, wiping out people's savings.
Yeah, we've all heard those stories. It's scary. And it's not just the price swings that worry me. What about the security risks? I mean, we've seen countless stories about Bitcoin exchanges being hacked and people losing all their funds. How can the state possibly guarantee the security of such a large Bitcoin investment?
Security is a major concern, for sure. While the blockchain technology itself is considered pretty secure, the systems built around it, not always so much.
Right, like those exchanges where people buy and sell Bitcoin.
Yeah, they've been targeted by hackers. And even institutional-grade security systems have been breached.
So there's always that risk that a cyber attack could compromise some of Pennsylvania's Bitcoin holdings.
That's a real possibility. And then, of course, there's the environmental impact of Bitcoin mining. It uses so much electricity.
It's a huge energy hog, isn't it?
It is. And critics argue that its reliance on proof-of-work mining, which is incredibly energy-intensive, makes it unsustainable long-term. A lot of the electricity used for mining comes from fossil fuels, so it's contributing to carbon emissions.
Yeah, that's a big concern these days.
It is. But supporters counter that argument by pointing to the growing trend of using renewable energy sources for mining. They say the industry is taking the environmental concerns seriously and working to address them.
So it sounds like there's some serious questions about whether this strategic Bitcoin reserve is a good idea. If there are all these concerns, why is Pennsylvania even considering it? Is this just some niche idea, or is there broader support for this kind of move?
This isn't just happening in Pennsylvania. The idea of governments holding Bitcoin reserves has been gaining some traction nationally. Yeah. Senator Loomis, for example, has been a vocal advocate for Bitcoin and has even proposed a bill to create a regulatory framework for digital assets at the federal level.
Didn't the Trump administration also float the idea of a strategic Bitcoin reserve a while back?
They did. So this isn't some fringe idea from a few Bitcoin enthusiasts. It's something that serious people are talking about.
It's definitely becoming more mainstream. So what happens in Pennsylvania could really have a ripple effect across the country.
Absolutely. If their experiment is successful, it could encourage other states and maybe even the federal government to follow suit. But if it goes badly,
It could scare everyone off.
it could really set back the whole movement toward wider Bitcoin adoption.
Yeah. It's a gamble with huge implications, not just for Pennsylvania, but for the future of cryptocurrency in the U.S. But what does all this mean for the average person, for our listeners? They're not investing millions in Bitcoin. They're just trying to understand what's going on. So let's bring this back down to earth for a second. What does Pennsylvania's Bitcoin gamble really mean for the average person, our listener? They're not state officials. They're not investing millions in Bitcoin. They just want to understand what's going on.
Right, but here's the thing. The outcome of this experiment in Pennsylvania, it could really impact the whole country. Think about it. If the state manages to navigate those risks and their investments perform well, it might just pave the way for more states to embrace Bitcoin. maybe even the federal government.
So is this like a sign that Bitcoin's going mainstream? Could we see a future where we're using it to buy groceries, pay our rent,
Yeah.
our taxes?
It's definitely possible. I mean, what Pennsylvania's doing, it really legitimizes Bitcoin in a way we haven't seen before. And if other states jump on board, it could create this ripple effect, really accelerating adoption of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies too.
But what if it all blows up in their face? What if those price swings wipe out a big chunk of Pennsylvania's investment? What happens then?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If Pennsylvania's Bitcoin investments tank, it could totally scare off other states that are considering doing the same thing. It could also give more fuel to the Bitcoin skeptics and really set back progress for crypto adoption.
So it's like we're at a fork in the road. On one side, you have the traditional financial system, the one with central banks and government-issued currencies. And on the other, there's this new world of decentralized finance, all powered by cryptocurrencies.
And Pennsylvania is basically saying, hey, we're going down the crypto path. It's a bold move. The outcome could change everything we think we know about money.
I mean, it's wild to even think about the possibilities. Imagine using Bitcoin for everything. Paying bills, buying a house, even getting paid by your employer in Bitcoin.
It sounds like science fiction now, but Pennsylvania's actions suggest it might not be so far-fetched after all.
It really does make you think. But we're still in the very early stages of all this whole technological revolution. And nobody knows for sure how it's going to play out.
Right, but Pennsylvania is drawing a line in the sand. And the whole world's watching to see what happens next.
One thing's for sure, this is a story that's just getting started. Pennsylvania's Bitcoin gamble is just the tip of the iceberg. This is a much bigger conversation about the future of money itself.
And the result of all this could completely reshape the financial landscape globally.
So keep an eye on Pennsylvania, folks. What happens there could be a preview of what's coming for the rest of us.
That's it for our deep dive into Pennsylvania's Bitcoin gamble. We'll continue to follow this story closely, so stay tuned for updates. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring the ever-evolving world around us.